while you're turning there, I'll go ahead and give you a breakdown of what's been happening in Mark 6 before we get to verse 34. At the beginning of Mark 6, Jesus turns around and he gives his disciples power. He gives them an anointing like they've never had under his ministry. And he turns around and he tells them, we're going to split up into like groups. I'm going to split you guys up into small groups. You're going to go out, you're going to preach, teach, heal. And they did all that. For the first time ever, the disciples had the power to go up and lay hands on somebody and heal them on the spot, just like they've watched Jesus do this entire time they've been together. So they've been out doing that, and it says they came back and met with Jesus, and they started telling him what all they had done, what all they had said, and just kind of telling him, giving them a report of what had happened while they were out. And Jesus tells them, like, he knows they're tired. He's like, okay, well, that's great. Let's go get on the ship. Let's go to the other side, and let's rest a while. You know, we're going to take a break. And then in verse 34 it says, when Jesus, he came out, saw much people, and was moved with compassion toward them because they were as sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. What happened was the disciples got on the ship, they turned around, somebody had seen them, they ran back and started getting there sick, and they all ran. They were like, they wanted to come get their healing. They saw those men, but they didn't see them. They saw the hope that was with them. They saw the healing that came with these men that were empowered by Jesus. And so they came out, and the first thing we'll talk to you about is where our perspective meets his provision. The first thing you got to realize about these guys is their perspective. They were tired. They've been out working. It's like if you're working a long shift and your manager tells you you can take a break, and then all of a sudden your store gets swamped with people. Oh, no, hold on. We're going to have to take a minute. You're going to have to work some more. It's like, come on now. Like, you're ready for that break. You're ready to chill for a minute, drink a drink, something. They were ready to chill for a minute. And Jesus says, no, he was moved with compassion towards them. No, we're going to deal with these people first. And so in verse 35 it says, the day was now far spent. His disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away that they may go into the country round about and into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. So their initial reaction to him saying, let's talk to them is, it's break time. Like, we don't want to talk to them right now. Let's send them away. They can go home and do their own thing. So that's the first problem with their perspective. Jesus turns around and says, we're going to feed them. He says, give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth of bread and give them to eat? John 6, 9 and 10 says, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? Like, their perspective was they went from being tired and not wanting to do it to now they're doubting Jesus' ability to get it done. And so the way that God answers this, our perspective meets his provision. The first part, verse 39 says, and he commanded them to make all sit down by companies, where? Upon the green grass. In John 6, verse 10, it says, Jesus said, make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the first part is it all starts with your perspective. You may feel like you're in the middle of this desert, but anytime Jesus is around, there's going to be green grass in your desert. He's already got it there. He's got it waiting for you. The other part of it is don't let your perspective get in the way of your ministry and what people see when they look at you. Somebody else may be in the middle of a desert and then they look at you and see their green grass. You may be that green grass in somebody else's desert. So it all starts with your perspective, and then his provision goes on in verse 41 and 42. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, held it up to heaven, blessed it, brake it, and it says he divided it among them all. Verse 42, they did all eat and were filled. We've all heard that part of the story. We knew God provided when there was little. He turned little into much. So you've got where our perspective meets his provision. You can't allow being tired and being in those desert places and wanting to take a break. You can't allow that to take away from your ministry and what you're doing in people's lives. And then I want to talk to you about where our storms meet his sovereignty. You go to verse 45, and straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ship and to go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, while he sent the people away. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. And when even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the 4th watch of the night he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea. So it says they were toiling and rowing. And one thing you got to understand about these guys, the 12 disciples, most of them were professional fishers before they started following Jesus. Like, that's what they did. They went out into the sea, and I'm sure the weather was not always perfect. So, I mean, you got to imagine these guys are rowing all day. They're pulling these heavy nets in. These guys are probably pretty strong by this point. The fact that they're toiling and rowing shows you, like, this was a legitimate storm. This wasn't just some rain and they decided to complain about it. In the middle of this storm, it says they were in the midst of the sea in the middle of the night. They couldn't see the land. That's the other part of their storm, is they had lost their direction. They couldn't see where they were going anymore. And then where God's sovereignty meets all this, obviously in verse 48 when it says He came to them walking upon the sea, I don't have to explain to you why that's God and His sovereignty walking on water. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory on how He's sovereign. But the other part of this sovereignty that I want you to see is throughout all of those verses right there, He departed into a mountain to pray. And when even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and He alone on the land. So I want you to think about for a minute, if you've ever been to the beach, you've ever walked out on your balcony at night, you've looked out onto the ocean, you can probably see like a good, probably 100 yards out into the ocean. If there was a boat out there, you might be able to see it. You know, if you had a full moon kind of thing, you might be able to see the boat. Probably wouldn't be able to see that people were struggling to row that boat. So the thing about it is, though, He's not on a balcony looking 100 yards down to the ocean. He's in a mountain, and they're in the middle of a sea. And it says that He saw them toiling and rowing. He was all man and all God. I would be hard-pressed to say that the all-man part literally saw them. Like, that would be some crazy vision, to look down from a mountain and see people toiling and rowing in the middle of a sea through the clouds that were causing a storm. You all drove here in the rain. You know how rain limits your visibility anyways. I think that shows His sovereignty in the all-God part, that while He was still that far away, He still saw them and knew exactly what was going on in that ship in the middle. So we can't ever underestimate God's power and what He's doing in the middle of our storms. So you've got where our perspective meets His provision. You've got where our storm meets His sovereignty. And then I want to talk to you about where our forgetfulness meets His faithfulness. This entire story, from top to bottom, is loaded down with the disciples, which shows our, as man, forgetfulness. You started out at the very beginning. They forgot why they were there. They were ready for their break, send them away. But then God was faithful through their forgetfulness. He was faithful to the people that had followed Him out to where they were at, even when the people that were His followers forgot about those same people. He was still faithful to them. In Matthew 14:16, it says, "But Jesus said to them, They need not depart, give ye them to eat." So God was still going to be faithful to those people following Him, even when the people that we're supposed to put ourselves in their shoes forgot about them. The second part is them doubting God's power and provision and ability to feed the people. In John 6:7 and 9, talking about 200 penny worth is not sufficient for them, that they may have a little. What are these 5 loaves and 2 fish among so many? They were doubting that. But then God the Father shows His faithfulness, answering Jesus' prayer when He blessed the food, and all ate and all were filled. And then the last part is they lost their direction literally on the sea, just like we do figuratively in the middle of our storms. They're out there. Matthew 14:24 says, "Now the ship was in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary." I'm pretty sure that was before compasses were invented. Could be wrong, but I don't think they were around back then. So anytime you're in a rowboat, like these guys were relying on sight. They always used landmarks. Like they just knew where they were going. When you take all your visibility, all your landmarks away, and the waves start tossing you so you can't even row a straight line anymore, you're going to lose your direction for sure. And then in verse 51, He went up into the ship and the wind ceased. God was faithful to them even in the midst of their storm. He came out, got on the boat, ceased the wind, and took them to dry land. But one thing that I do want to point out, at the end of verse 48, fourth watch of the night He cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. I've read this story a million times, and that's never jumped out at me before until I started studying for this. And He would have passed by them. Now, you could say that the boat's in the middle, Jesus is like right here, and He was just kind of taking a weird angle getting to them. If He'd have gone straight, He would have passed by them. But I don't think that's what He's saying right there. I think when He would have passed by them, it's a literal example of what He says in Revelation 3:20, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him and he with me." Jesus is not the kind of God that's going to come barge through the door of your heart or barge into the middle of your sea. He's not going to impose into your storm. He has to be asked to come in. A lot of times we get in the middle of our storms and we're like, where is God at? Why is He not helping me right now? Or we get complacent with, oh, well, he's taking care of these a million other times, I'll just wait it out. Call him, ask him, like, God, I need your help. Lord, I need you now kind of mentality. Like, we have to ask him to come into the middle of our storms. And then the last thing I want to talk to you about is yesterday's miracles. If you haven't heard anything else that I've said tonight, if none of it's made sense, this is the part that I really want you to take away from this. So, first let's talk about the fragments. John 6:12 says, when they were filled, he said unto his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. So that made me ask, why was it so imperative that they not leave scraps of bread on the ground? I mean, was Jesus just being so frugal that he didn't want to waste any of it? Just go pick up all the bread. That's what we have to eat tonight. Probably not, because he just fed 5,000 people with the small amount. So I don't think he was worried about where his food was coming from. But it says in verse 43, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments and the fishes. So the picture I see at that point is each one of the disciples probably had a basket. Probably bigger than this. It's like old-timey baskets. Probably a huge basket. And they're walking around just like FCA on a Saturday morning after a football game. They're going through and they're cleaning up the stands. Like there's just fragments of bread laid everywhere. They're going through, they're picking it up. They come back to the middle and they're kind of like, oh, we all got one. That was convenient. Like that was kind of ironic that we all have one basket full. So they're probably just standing there like, well, what should we do with them now? Well, in situations like when I've been in Nicaragua and stuff, like you always want to get super spiritual on it and say, oh, well, we've got this left over. Let's pray over it real quick, and then we'll give it, to the families that need it the most, and we'll do that. So I can hear Peter now, because Peter always had that mentality of saying something first and then thinking about it later. He got in trouble a lot with his mouth. He cut the guy's ear off. He, said, I'll never deny you, and then denied him 3 times. Peter had a lot of times where he said something and then had to eat it later. So I can kind of see him get there together now. And Peter's like, well, I think we should pray over these baskets and then go out and hand them out, to the families that maybe a widow, or just hand them out to the people that need them the most. That's what we should do. And so then he's like, I'll tell them. He walks over there to Jesus and he's like, hey, I want to throw this out there. It was kind of my idea, but they all thought it was a good idea. We talked about it. I think we should take these 12 baskets and go give them to the people that need it the most. And then, so they're all standing there holding one basket though. And then verse 45 says, and straightway he constrained them to the ship. So, straightway, meaning immediately, like there was no hesitation. As soon as they had gathered the fragments, he constrained them to the ship. The word constrain, to me, doesn't sound like a happy word. Like nobody had to constrain me to come to church tonight. You're not constrained to do the things that you want to do. It's something that you're being almost forced to do. So, I can still see them sitting there with their baskets talking about, we should go out and do this. And he's like, get on the ship. Like, I'm not going to tell you again, go get on the ship now. So they're kind of like, all right, whatever. And then I can see them sitting there. They get on this little rowboat, and they sit down. They probably got it between their legs, like trying to figure out where they should put this basket. And they start rowing across to the middle of the sea. And they're probably sitting there like, don't you guys think that would have been a good idea? That we could have shared these baskets with people? And then, hey man, it's supposed to rain tonight? Like, they're starting to see these clouds, wondering what in the world they're supposed to do with these baskets still. Give them another hour. They're out in the middle of the sea now. And it's starting to get hard to row. They're like, man, he's supposed to be the Messiah. You think he could have avoided this rain? If we'd have gone and handed these baskets out, we might have missed this. It might have been on the back side of it. And then turn around and give them another 30 minutes. And then they're sitting there like, no, we're going to die. This is over. This boat's taking on water. It's over. I don't know what to do. And why in the world did he make us bring these baskets? Like, at this point, they're just mad. The baskets are in the way. Well, let's see why he wanted them to take these baskets. Look with me in verse 51 and 52. And he went up into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. And then what does verse 52 say? For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. Considered not the miracle of the loaves. And that got them all bent out of shape. So, the first thing you got to think about is that. They were sore amazed, beyond measure, just wondering, wow, he just ceased the wind. And they had fragments of yesterday's miracles sitting in their lap. How do you forget God's power that quick? These are the same guys that had just been empowered, been out healing people, stuff that we can't even do today that we would think, oh wow, that's awesome. They've been out, they've been in the middle of this, it's been thick with them. And they turn around and they get sore amazed when he ceases the wind, and they had